Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 5th of October. And first, I apologize for not being able to get this video by the 10 o'clock time that I indicated I would be posting on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I was having some technical issues. As a result, I have eliminated the due date for today's attendance question. So hopefully that will make up for the fact that this video was not posted on time. Where we are is transitioning over into drama while I am in the midst of grading your journals and getting those back to you. And hopefully the journals for the short story section will help inform some of your decisions for paper number 1, which you should be thinking about at this particular time. And that said, the readings I had assigned today are to help you prepare for drama. And on page 1077, there were some readings about reading drama. And the good news is that many of the suggestions we've already talked about for short story are suggestions you can use for drama and poetry and basically for all genres. But drama is somewhat different than short story. First of all, short story deals with one particular incident usually, or one particular mood. That's not necessarily going to be the case with dramas. Dramas are much longer and more complex. They oftentimes have multiple plots associated with them as well. And in terms of drama, obviously they are meant to be performed. So in addition to reading drama, we are going to be watching performance. And that means something like the stage directions are going to be particularly important because those are the pieces of information given by the dramatist that we should be focusing on as a reader so we can visualize what would be happening on stage. These are the cues the actors are given from the author about how they should proceed. And some dramas have a good number of stage directions and some have very little, depending on the author's intent. You should also pay careful attention to the characters because dramas are dialogue based. So we are going to be having shifts in dialogue between characters. So you need to pay attention if you're reading a drama in particular, which character is speaking. And that means that you have to take some time to look at the character's name. Obviously, all of this would happen much more fluidly if you were watching a drama unfold in front of you because you would have human beings who have differences in their vocal inflections and their voices and their appearances and their costuming so that you could differentiate one from another. So you need to try to visualize as much as possible what these individuals could look like and make sure that you don't confuse one character with another when you're reading. Again, ultimately, dramas are meant to be performed, so I wanted to talk about the performance piece as much as the writing piece. But the 3 dramas that we are going to be reading this semester are particularly well written. So they have all of the elements that we've been talking about in terms of short story and also of literature in general. And that we are going to have symbolism and we're going to have metaphor and we're going to have irony and foreshadowing in addition to the acting component that's associated with drama. And obviously that means that there's an additional level of interpretation because a director and an actor would make some decisions. So if you've ever watched, for instance, what's probably the most popular connection that we have to drama, which is television, and you know if they happen to change the actor playing a particular character, the writing is the same, but the character comes off very differently because basically there's a different actor and a different interpretive approach to that particular character. Again, probably our most common experience with dramas are it happened to be with television just because of the convenience associated with television, though there is nothing that can mimic a performance that's live. And it's very similar to watching a live concert if you've ever watched a live concert as opposed to listening to the music that's been pre-recorded. It's a completely different experience, much more electric, much more in the moment, and definitely much more memorable. It becomes an event. But since most of us probably have experience with television, what the textbook does is that it talks about a television. Actually, it was a comedy, but it has also the dramatic elements. What's interesting about drama is that we use the words in 2 ways. Drama can reference a genre or a kind of writing, which is where we're at now. But we often talk about drama in terms of something being very serious and being very dramatic. So it's possible to have in the drama section, the genre section, a comedy, which means that there is a humorous element associated with it as well. There was a drama that was particularly popular in the 1990s, or I should say there was a television show that was particularly popular in the 1990s. That was probably the heyday of television, before the advent of the internet and streaming and all of the media possibilities that we have today, as I talk about in my media classes. But the television show was called Seinfeld, and actually our textbook, and this is on page 1110, uses that as an example to illustrate how important it is to basically have the actors portray the role rather than just reading drama, which can come off as fairly flat. And in fact, you can see that we've got a section of a script, and on page 1110, I'll just read a little bit of it. This is in Scene G, the interior of NBC's President's Office Day. The mood is jovial. Stu Shermack is there, along with Susan Ross, Jay Crespi, and Russell Dalrymple, the head of the network. And Stu says to Jerry, the bit I really liked, where the parakeet flew into the mirror. Now that's funny. And then George says, the parakeet in the mirror? That's a good one, Stu. And Jerry says, yeah, it's one of my favorites. And Russell says, what about you, George? Have you written anything we might know? And George says, well, possibly. I wrote an off-Broadway show, La Cocina. Actually, it was an off-Broadway. It was a comedy about a Mexican chef. And they go on, and this is pretty flat and dry. But you'll notice that in the notes below, I was able to find this particular scene. And I encourage you to click on that and to watch the actors actually perform this scene, because what we are reading is their script. And you can see that it's a very different experience indeed, as they make it come alive. Now, obviously, you're at an advantage if you've watched the television show Seinfeld before, when you are reading the script, because you are familiar with the actors and some of the backstories. You're at even a greater advantage if you happen to watch this particular episode. But ultimately, you may be approaching this having very little to no information about the actual television series and the performances. And that's probably going to be the case with the dramas that we're going to be reading. So keep in mind that each time you watch a performance or each time you do a reading, it's going to become much more comfortable to you. And the first we're beginning with is Oedipus the King. It's an important piece from a historical perspective because it helped to establish what we call the tragic tradition, which is probably what Shakespeare is best known for when we think about some of Shakespeare's great plays, things like Macbeth and Othello and so forth. And there were criteria that were established in Oedipus the King, as we will talk about, that basically playwrights used afterwards, and they would follow that criteria or they would deliberately deviate from it because they were trying to do something new and creative. So it's not too surprising that Shakespeare would oftentimes deviate because he was known for doing new and creative things. Then our second drama that we are going to be reading and also watching will be A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a Shakespearean drama, but it is a comedy, and there are specific rules for Shakespearean comedy, and we will address what those rules are. But even in today's world, I think we have an understanding that comedy should be lighthearted, and it shouldn't be sad, and it shouldn't be filled with negatives in the way that we will see with Oedipus the King, which is a tragedy. And that's one of the reasons why I had assigned A Midsummer Night's Dream, because I wanted something a little lighter, as well as it is a very common and popular play to read and perform in junior high school and high school. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. And then ultimately we'll end with the drama entitled Raisin in the Sun. That is not included in your textbook, unfortunately, but it is a phenomenal drama. It's much more contemporary, so I suspect that the reading and the watching process will be much easier for you. And the themes are very contemporary, about an African-American family moving into a neighborhood where they aren't wanted because of their ethnicity. But that said, when we talk about literature, all literature has some element of timeless and universal concerns, or else we still wouldn't be reading it. So even something as old as Oedipus the King from 430 BC Greece should have elements within it that we can connect to as a modern day audience. And the same with The Midsummer Night's Dream, which is centered on love and all of the consequences, sometimes negative, associated with tensions in love. So basically, We are scheduled to spend several classes on Oedipus the King, and actually all of the dramas. We're reading just 3 dramas in this unit, but the dramas are longer than the short stories. So while we've got multiple classes associated to the dramas, that will allow us time, well, to finish reading the drama and to also watch performance as well. So you can see that from the 12th of October to the 19th is devoted to just Oedipus the King. And what would be ideal, though I understand the world isn't always ideal, is that by the 12th of October, you would have completed reading Sophocles' Oedipus the King in its entirety, so that at home you're working on the next drama and reading it, and that happens to be A Midsummer Night's Dream. But again, we've got multiple classes that are devoted to Oedipus the King. And we also have paper number 1, and that's going to be due on short story. And what I've done with that is I've given you some suggested paper topics, as you know, for paper number 1. And I've also wanted to give you some general instruction on how to write a paper. So we've done that as well. Remember that the paper topics, and they are in the syllabus and other documents folder, are merely suggestions. You can come up with your own. And I very much encourage you to do something like that when you are writing about your own let's say, interests. It's usually a much stronger paper. But that said, I've given some suggested paper topics so that if it turns out that you're not quite sure how to proceed with that, well, then you can do something like talking about some of the suggested topics that I've given you. So you know that we talked a little bit about the construction of writing a paper, about planning, writing, and editing. And this is a handout that I've put in the syllabus and other documents folder as well. It basically is a handout that, in my opinion, is perhaps one of the best I've ever seen about constructing a paper. It was given to me when I was an undergraduate student many moons ago. And I think that it does a really good job of sort of talking about the planning stage, which oftentimes is skipped by individuals, and they try to go straight into the writing stage, and they suffer consequences because of that, negative consequences, because they don't give themselves enough time to think. The planning stage is when you can just come up with ideas and you don't necessarily have to follow any particular kind of format. You're just brainstorming in effect. And then there is the writing stage, and that's where you actually begin to construct sentences. And if you begin with the writing stage and you don't start with the planning stage, what usually ends up happening is that you end up losing quite a bit of time. So you don't want to do that. And then finally, there's the editing stage, and that's where you do revision and you polishing to submit in paper. But because so many people start writing late, they don't have the proper amount of time to do the editing stage. So I encourage you to begin now thinking about that first paper so that you've got time for all of the stages. And I will review that handout in further depth next class. But basically, I'm hoping this is a review from your introductory English class. You've got to think about your first paragraph, your introduction, which is going to be including your thesis, which happens to be your main point. And that's something that you may not know when you begin writing. You might need to discover it over the course of your writing. This is also where you list the name of the author and the name of the textbook. So it's very clear to the reader what you are reading or what you are examining in your writing. And then you've got body paragraphs in the plural. And this is where you give your evidence and details, because basically I'm paid to take the opposite perspective. So if you happen to say that, let's say, Krebs in Soldier's Home is feeling alienated, I will say, no, he's not. And even though we've talked about that in class, so I obviously agree with you. But you have to provide the pieces of evidence from the text. You would do that through quotation, putting it in your own language, and also paraphrase. In other words, you would be using you would be using either the quotation, which is the exact wording, or you would be using paraphrase, which happens to be your stating in your own language those pieces of evidence that are important in order to be able to support your particular point. And then finally, you've got a concluding paragraph that's going to give some sense of closure. And keep in mind that a paragraph is devoted to one idea, and it's supposed to examine an idea in depth, which means that a paragraph has to have a certain amount of length to it. 3 or more sentences, probably much more, because you want to expand and develop. That a paragraph has to have an introduction, and it has to have a body, and it has to have a conclusion. So that's where the 3 comes from. Even though in journalistic writing, we might be writing 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs. That's not what we would do for, let's say, the writing associated with academia, which is also transferable to the writing that we do in the business world. So that's how it becomes important. So ultimately, what I wanted to do next class is to talk a little bit about the elements of drama and writing about drama, and Sophocles, who happens to be the author of Oedipus the King, and well as talk about tragic character, which are some of the elements that are associated with drama. And then what I wanted to do too was to talk about that handout in a little bit more depth. Again, I suspect this is more review than anything else about how to write a paper. You'll remember that our textbook also gives several suggestions on how to go about doing that as well. And you have the option to do a revision for your first paper. So basically, you can think of your first paper as a kind of draft that you would submit in to me for feedback. And then if you wanted to, you could redo it for a higher grade, and you would get the higher of the 2 grades. And I don't feel that I'm giving you any kind of unfair advantage, because the reality is that ultimately you are writing the way that professional writers write when you go through edits and drafts and revisions and so forth. So you've got that option if it turns out that you feel some anxiety about that first paper. And that was going to be today's attendance question, to try to encourage you to start thinking about paper number 1. And today's attendance question, and again, I removed the deadline because I was late in terms of posting this video, is what story are you considering writing your first paper about, and why? What short story are you considering writing your first paper about, and why? Understand, when you answer this question, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're stuck with following that particular response. So certainly you can change your mind along the way. But I wanted you to begin thinking about, out of the short stories we've read in the short story unit, which short story you think might be of use for you to do a paper on. Approximately 4 to 5 pages, but as long or as short as it needs to be. Double space, 1-inch margins, when you're examining one element or one idea. And this is very different from the journals, where you didn't necessarily have to have a particular focus. So, and if you'll remember some of the suggested topics that I had given you, and you can mix and match some of these. We were talking about isolation in a sorrowful woman. She literally isolates herself, but she's also isolated from perhaps society because of the expectations placed upon her. Symbolism and Story of an Hour. Not that other stories don't have symbolism, but Story of an Hour is particularly packed with symbolism because it's so short, and the symbolism is connected to the idea of freedom, which is what Mrs. Mallard experiences. The theme of death in Rose for Emily, when we were talking about not just the literal deaths of the characters, but the ending or the death of a way of life of Southern aristocracy that just is no longer beneficial or effective for society. Love in Rose for Emily and Van der Zee's Secret Sorrow. You'll remember Secret Sorrow was our example of formulaic fiction. So you're not going to get a very complex examination of love. So talking about love from that perspective, and then comparing it to a place where we get a much more complex perspective in a piece of literature about love. A Rose for Emily would be a possibility. Ambiguity in Young Goodman Brown, and that ultimately we can never know for certain if the witch meeting happened, but we do know how Goodman has changed because of it. And the ambiguity that exists within all of us, and that we aren't purely good or evil, but a combination of the two, which Goodman is unable to accept. A Soldier's Home and the Role of Conflict, and obviously all pieces of literature have conflict in them, but since this is about a soldier, basically soldiers go to war, to conflicts, and we see how that conflict changes Krebs, not necessarily for the better. The theme of battle in Ellison's Battle Royal, and definitely we see a literal battle in the boxing match, but we see our narrator battling with himself and with others in terms of understanding his place in society. And that has a lot to do with his ethnicity, with the color of his skin. And compare and contrast Girl and Carver's Popular Mechanics. On the surface, they don't necessarily seem similar. They're both very short and very direct, but I thought because they are so short that it might be perhaps a bit more challenging for you to write a 4 or 5 page paper. So comparing and contrasting these two pieces, or other pieces as well, but particularly these two, might be useful. And then a good question to ask yourself, I put at the bottom of this, when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing, is have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? And that's quite a tall order. And basically, this is what that handout about writing papers is about that I'm going to be reviewing. And it's why you want to start writing a paper sooner rather than later, so that you can try to be as clear, concise, believable, and graceful in the actual construction. And you'll notice that in this quotation as well, I have in quotation marks after that, in parentheses, the author's last name, which happens to be Biddle, and a page number, which happens to be 9. And then I close my parentheses. And again, I'm hopeful that, and then I give my ending punctuation. And I'm hopeful this looks somewhat familiar to you. This is the MLA, Modern Language Association, System of Parenthetical Documentation, how you document within an actual paper itself when we're quoting. But again, I'll talk about quotation a little bit more next class. So I encourage you to begin your readings as soon as possible with Oedipus the King, the play. Again, our initial readings are basically about the idea of Sophocles and just Greek tragedy that we'll talk a little bit more about next class. And also, we will be getting ready for our first paper. So, I hope you're doing well. I am doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about Sophocles and drama, as well as talking about writing papers. Take care. Bye-bye.